Casey, you know we love a caper on this show.
Oh, we love a caper on this show.
Today, I have what I believe is the biggest tech caper of at least the past year.
Okay, well then let's hear about it.
So, and I want to preface this caper by saying that this is going to involve a lot of terms from Linux and open source software development and various databases. And I need you not to fall asleep because the payoff is going to be worth it.
Will there be a quiz at the end?
There will be.
Okay.
Yes. So this is a very interesting and strange story that came out of the world of cybersecurity over the past week. It involves a 38-year-old software engineer named Andres Freund.
Mm-hmm. Freund of the pod.
Yeah, Freund of the pod. He lives in San Francisco. He works at Microsoft, and he stumbled into what may be the biggest attempted cyber attack in history.
Which it's crazy that sort of just one person could stumble into something as big as this is.
Yeah, so I've been totally obsessed with this story. Basically, I think we should just explain off the bat that the internet is a very sort of rickety contraption. I think most people don't understand this unless you talk to people who are engineers or work in cybersecurity or sort of develop the kind of building blocks on which the entire internet rests.
It's weirdly precarious that it works, and honestly somewhat miraculous, right? Because in part, so much of the internet, the technology we rely on, depends on these tiny little open source projects that might be maintained by, for example, one person.
Yes, yeah. There's this famous XKCD comic where you have kind of like a vast machine that is sort of resting on one little thin like rod. The elaborate machine is labeled all modern digital infrastructure, and the little peg that it's resting on is labeled a project some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining since 2003. And this story is the literal instantiation of that cartoon because
this is a story about the tiny peg.
Yes, this is the tiny peg that is holding up the giant machine called the internet, and how one guy, Andres Freund, discovered basically by accident a plot to kind of mess with the entire internet as we know it.
All right, so how did he stumble across this plot, Kevin?
So he works at Microsoft. He develops this piece of open source database software called Postgres. The details aren't important, but this is sort of a big database. Lots of companies use it. It's open source. Andres is one of the people who maintains this database. As part of his work, he does a bunch of tests to make sure that various pieces of this software are running correctly. A few weeks ago, he's doing some tests and he starts noticing some weird error messages. And at the time, he's flying back from Germany. He was visiting his parents. He's German. And he's sort of jet lagged. He thinks, okay, maybe this is not important. I'm just going to kind of like ignore these error messages. Then he gets home to San Francisco. He starts running some more tests, and he starts noticing some weird, some other weird errors.
Some anomalies.
Some anomalies, yes. He notices, for example, that this process called SSH, it's running sort of slower than possible by a little bit. It's using more processing power than it usually would. It's causing some memory errors that usually aren't there.
Now, Kevin, when you say it's slowed down, is it slowing down by like 30 seconds?
No. So these delays, they are tiny. It's like measured in milliseconds. But, Andres is a very detail-oriented guy. He's been working on this particular piece of software for a long time, and he kind of knows what it's all supposed to look like. And so he starts noticing like a little lag there, a little more CPU usage here. Something is going wrong.
His spidey sense starts to tinkle.
Exactly. So he basically starts digging in and investigating, and he traces the issue to this set of data compression tools called XZUtils.
I wondered if it might be an XZUtils error.
Yes. So, basically the details of what this thing is are not important.
But come on, try. It would just entertain me.
It's a set of data compression tools. That is all I know.
Okay, sort of like the premise of the old Silicon Valley TV show.
Exactly.
Yeah. But
XZUtils is used by Linux, the open source operating system. Mm-hmm. Another piece of information that you need to know about this story is that Linux is probably the most important piece of software in the world.
Linux is everywhere.
Yes. So Linux is used by the vast majority of the world's data centers, servers, like every majorly important computer in the world runs on Linux.
If there's a computer talking to another computer somewhere, Linux is involved.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this little tiny software package, XZUtils, it is a very small piece of a very important piece of software. So Andre starts looking into these weird delays and these weird anomalies, and he eventually starts looking at the source code for XZ-utils, and he discovers something that blows his mind, which is he finds a backdoor. Now, a backdoor, I know you're going to make a joke about this.
I'm not going to make a joke about backdoors.
Wow, you're passing up jokes about backdoors today. Something is wrong. Are you okay?
In my mind, it's just funnier to keep saying that I'm not going to make a joke about it.
This is a fastball over the plate, my friend. So basically, a backdoor is a piece of malicious code that is inserted into a piece of software that allows an attacker to basically remotely access or control it, or sort of slip in some code that they wrote, basically do something malicious. It's kind of a key to unlock a piece of software with the intent to mess with it in some way.
Got it.
So Andres, he's not a cybersecurity engineer. He's just a guy who maintains a database. But he finds this evidence that XZ-utils, this tiny piece of Linux, has been compromised, that someone has intentionally gone in and placed a backdoor there that if you are that person, you can then go in and you can basically tamper with any computer that is running SSH on Linux, which is to say the vast majority of the important computers on Earth.
Which, like, I'm just imagining being him, and like you've noticed this like series of small anomalies, and you have that feeling that something is amiss here. But I bet that even in his wildest imagination, he did not imagine that he found a very sophisticated backdoor.
No, so I talked to Andres about his discovery. He sort of walked me through the whole thing, and he says that at first he was sort of like skeptical of his own findings. He said it felt surreal. He said there were moments where I was like, I must have just had a bad night of sleep and had some fever dreams. Basically, this is like not the kind of thing that you find in a widely scrutinized piece of software like Linux. And so Andres, he looks at this, he says, man, I don't know, this just sounds like too big to be true. How could something like this, get approved and make its way into the release version of Linux? But he keeps digging, he keeps finding new evidence, and then last Friday, he basically writes up what he's found and sends it to this group of open source software developers, and he basically says, all these errors that I've been seeing, all these anomalies in this, in these very obscure software packages, it's all because this thing has been backdoored. Someone is here messing with this release, and they are intending to use this to basically break into a bunch of computers and do whatever they want.
So he rings the alarm.
And immediately, the entire cybersecurity world melts down. I talked to one researcher, Alex Stamos, who I know you know. He's a former CSO at Facebook. He's now involved in something called SentinelOne, which is a cybersecurity research firm. He told me this could have been the most widespread and effective backdoor ever planted in any software product.
Wow.
And basically, what people I talked to said is, look, if you have this backdoor, if you have this master key that lets you get into any Linux computer that is running SSH, this very ubiquitous software package, you essentially have a way to get into hundreds of millions of computers around the world. Once you're in there, you can steal private information, you can intercept encrypted traffic, you can plant malware, you can cause major disruptions to like big pieces of infrastructure, and critically, you can do all of this without being caught. Because part of what Andres discovers as he's investigating this backdoor is that whoever planted it there has taken steps to ensure that it is very hard to detect, right? And, basically, this would have worked if not for Andres and his very eagle-eyed, detail-oriented, like obsessive approach to trying to figure out what the heck was going on with these error messages.
This is why nerds are so important to the economy, and we need to celebrate them.
It's true.
We celebrate the nerds out there. The
It's
people
true.
that are like, this process is running 1 second too slow, cancel my afternoon, we
Yes.
celebrate you.
Totally. So this discovery, I think it's safe to say, it is a huge shockwave through the world of cybersecurity because, this thing was caught before it could do any real damage. It had not made it into the sort of widely used versions of Linux that all these servers run on, but it would have, and it would have been potentially disastrous. Now that Andres has kind of become this like nerd hero, all kinds of people are praising him. Satya Nadella, his sort of the chief executive of
boss.
Microsoft, his boss boss's boss's boss praised him for his curiosity and craftsmanship. There was a popular post that went around calling Andres the silverback gorilla of nerds. And people are basically comparing him to the little peg in the comic that all of modern capitalism rests on.
Okay, let's get to who did this, Kevin, because that's what everybody wants to know, right? Who's responsible for this backdoor?
So
who's this backdoor bandit?
So here's what we know so far. According to some researchers I talked to, basically said this is so elaborate, this plot was so sophisticated that it couldn't have just been like a random group of hackers. This had to have been like a nation state, like a Russia or a China or a North Korea, someone with access to vast resources and very skilled teams of hackers.
Well, I'm interested in that, Kevin, because as far as I can tell, the main thing that separates this attack from many of the other attacks that you see all the time is just how much time they invested in pulling it off, right? So talk to us about all of the time involved.
Yeah, so one of the cool things about open source software is that you can actually go back and like see all of the changes and who was requesting them and what they actually meant in terms of what ended up in the code. And so researchers have been going back and sort of trying to forensically look at all of the evidence, trying to kind of see how this happened. And they found a really interesting story buried in some of the details of this software. So back in 2021, there's a user who creates a GitHub account and starts contributing to various open source projects. This user uses the name Gia Tan for various reasons. Researchers actually don't think that's a real name. It's probably a pseudonym.
But a smarter pseudonym than the one I would have picked, which would have been Backdoor Wizard.
Yes. So Gia Tan, whoever it is, they start suggesting sort of changes to XZUtils starting back in 2022. And this is kind of the way that open source development kind of works is like people propose a bunch of changes and then these special, developers called maintainers who are sort of in charge of a project. They look at the proposed changes, they sort of test them, make sure they work, see what effects they have on performance. And then if they're good, they approve them and that kind of gets like merged into the main code.
But the basic idea is that everyone who participates is essentially a good Samaritan, right? There's somebody who comes along and says, I use this software. I notice this thing could be better. Why don't I write a little code to fix it? I'll submit it to you. And if you like it, you can share it with everyone.
Yes, and many of these projects only have one or a handful of maintainers attached to them because these are not like fast-moving software objects, right? These are not things that are being constantly refined and redeveloped. This is like infrastructure. This is like you built a plumbing duct for the internet, and it's just going to kind of sit there mostly, and people are going to build on it and use it for stuff that they're building. But you actually don't need much more than one person to kind of keep tabs on this project.
Right. It's mostly done, but software is never totally done.
Exactly. So this person, Gia Tan, or this group of people using this name Gia Tan, start kind of proposing changes, and then they start kind of gradually sort of social engineering the entire team that's involved in maintaining this project, which again is mostly comes down to one person, one maintainer who's been doing this for many years. So Gia Tan starts contributing these sort of minor proposed changes to XZUtils back in 2022. And then something interesting happens, which is that Gia Tan, whoever it is, whatever national hacking team it might have been, they start trying to basically take over control of XZUtils. And they do this by essentially seizing on the fact that the person who maintains this software project is getting kind of tired of doing it. They kind of don't want to do this anymore, it sort of sounds like. And so Gia Tan, whoever it is, kind of sticks their hand up and says, well, what if I was the maintainer? What if I could like solve this problem for you by taking over this very thankless task of maintaining this tiny little software library?
Let me take that problem off your hands.
So over the course of a couple of years, Gia Tan builds trust with the other people who are involved in contributing to this software tool and eventually gets named a maintainer of this project. And so he's able to kind of do the final approval for this proposed code change that would insert this hidden backdoor into this software project.
Effectively becoming a double agent, like something you would read out of a novel by Le Carré.
It's wild. It's like, honestly, the tradecraft, the kind of spycraft involved in this is a very sophisticated operation. It involves not just a technical piece of hacking, but also kind of a social piece where you're kind of winning over this small team of very harried, very underappreciated developers. You're volunteering to help them. You're kind of establishing your credibility in this very tiny community. And eventually you're using that that credibility to install a backdoor that will let whoever it is have access to hundreds of millions of computers and do whatever they want with them. It is a wild story.
It is. And now I know that we don't know truly anything about the real identity of Gia Tan, but I'll tell you, I like thinking of Gia Tan as a deadly woman assassin. It's like, you remember Carmen Sandiego? Back in the day, the old computer games, this sort of international criminal and you're very elusive. Gia Tan is the new Carmen Sandiego.
That's true.
You know?
And I think we should devote many episodes of this podcast to trying to track down Gia Tan.
At the end of every episode, we're going to say, where in the world is Gia Tan? And we're going to keep saying it until we find out. And
my favorite part of that show was the Do It rockapella. Do you remember that?
Yes, it was one of the only a cappella theme songs we ever had for a show, and it was so successful that they should bring that back.
That's true. I think there are a lot of things to say about this story. But one of the sort of interesting side discussions that I've seen come out of this, there's this whole group of people in Silicon Valley who believe that AI should all be open source. And that the reason that you would want something like, an AI language model to be open source is because then it'll actually be safer, because then you'll have not just one company kind of trying to keep the bad guys out. You'll have this kind of distributed army of volunteers who are constantly sort of looking through things, poking around in the source code.
You can tap into the global nerd hive.
Exactly. And that's sort of how you get things like Linux, which are the result of thousands of contributors working on their little pieces of this thing. Eventually, it all comes out, and it's pretty secure for the most part. And so that is one thing that those people are now saying is this episode with the XZ backdoor proves that all software needs to be open source.
Well,
what do you make of that?
I mean, look, all software does not need to be open source. It's perfectly fine to have normal private companies making their own software. But I think to the degree that a piece of software is foundational to how the internet works, there is a really great case for making it open source.
Yeah, so I am thankful to Andres, not just for saving us all from doom, but also for forcing me to learn about Linux development and open source repositories and maintainers.
And I guess I'm just struggling with one more question, Kevin, which is we enter this, brave new world where there are a lot of Gia Tans out there. What are you doing to protect your backdoor?
And that's all we have this week on Hard Fork. Let's go to the credits, please.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.